So just warning you guys, FYI, Pete and I put tons of planning into this discussion. No, I think what we wanted to cover here today, and we're even missing somebody, I think, by the way. What we wanted to cover, I think, is we're doing a lot of work on software identification right now, specifically what we just covered with CPE. I think the next big hurdle or next big thing that we're looking towards is Purl, and how those might fit together, and maybe even some other software identifiers. I think we're looking for feedback from the community on how to do some of this and how to make it the most useful to data consumers. And that is another thing I think there's a theme for a lot of us right now, is that, for a long time we've focused on the data producers and how they produce the data and what works for them. I think now, for any of you that are in the audience that are data consumers, I think we're very interested in your points of view and what things are most useful for you. How do we implement Purl and CPE and other software identifiers that we don't even know about right now in the best way that works for you? And how do we make it all work together? That's how I think I would introduce this. Pete, you have anything to add?
I want to take the opposite end of the problem set, which is people who are consuming the data are having a problem talking to their software provider. And the challenge they are having is, how do I know that I'm vulnerable or not? Because I have a scanner says I am, and often the producer is saying, but that is fixed or you have the wrong version. And so we have a data problem. I'm not going to call it a data aggregation problem. We have a data classification problem that, when you aggregate, provides a real headache for all of us. So the challenge we're trying to get to is the utility of CPE. How do we extend for things that we hadn't had before? We don't own this, by the way. This is an NVD. Tanya, it's by law, you guys have the CPE dictionary, correct? Yes. So it's their dictionary. And so it's not like we own this dictionary. We're trying to contribute to the dictionary in a way that makes it useful within the dictionary confines and adaptability that NVD has. So we realize that we're coming at this kind of from the side, and we're not here to overrun that. We're trying to help further refine that problem set so the consumer actually understands what they're looking at. And in some way, we're looking how to better describe vulnerable or not vulnerable. Because if you can't identify the components, you're really in a creek. And that means we have to extend past what was the proprietary approach. Not that we don't have open source in that, but we just don't have it well accounted for. And when folks, I want to try not to talk as Red Hat too much. I have people who are actually experts in a room from Red Hat, Rogue and Martin for starters. But how do we overall as an industry do that? Because I hear customers really hollering and they can't read it. They don't understand when we take something that was upstream fix and then we did something called a backport, and how does a scanner interpret that so a consumer sees it, or how can a consumer see it directly, or someone who's using it further downstream from us? So this is the crux of the problem. And this is not an easy way to define, because there's different approaches. And we just named CPE and Purl. And, there's probably a half a dozen other things you can add.
Omnivore.
I try not to use that word.
We have an Omnivore representative in the room as well. Andrew is here.
I'm not going to speak for it. I'm going to let Andrew talk to it. Yes.
Hi. Oh, is it? Yeah. I think one problem that I'm seeing is potentially there's no single source of truth. So I had a chance to speak to some of the people at the booth in the room too. And it seems like CPEs are the more common product identifier. And we know that organizations like Microsoft, they include CPEs in their own CVEs, but there are vulnerability scanners out there that create CPEs as well, for like published CVEs. So it's not only now that there are some CNAs creating their CPEs, vulnerability scanners are creating CPEs, and then now we're introducing CPE applicability. So there's like multiple things that now vulnerability scanners have to be made aware of, and they might not be made aware of. But shouldn't the CVE JSON files issued by CNAs be the single source of truth? And vulnerability scanners use those as the use the product identifiers there, because surely CNAs should know the most about their own vulnerabilities and their own products so that customers can identify vulnerabilities on their systems.
That's a great question and great observation. And I think if you look at the CVE program and what we've done since 2016, we've federated the publication of CVE records. And I think what we're trying to do with CPE is, before we gave the ability to CNAs to publish their own vulnerability data, now we're giving them that ability to publish CPE data or, standardized software identification, because they're the ones that know the products, their own products best. And they're the ones that can represent that product information the best. That's just my opinion. Now, there may be some differences of opinion in the room. I don't know, but that's the way that I look at it. Pete.
Yeah, from a CVE board position, what we're trying to do is we believe that the CNA is the authoritative source. Okay, you can go to our metrics page, you'll see it's a couple of the spots there on CVE. This past year, since VoneCon last year, actually, we started evaluating the data that came in, and we focused on 4 fields. There were CVSS, CWE related fields. We're collecting CPE. We know that we have a deficit across the board. I look at it that if you look at a Vone scanner assigned to CVE, then the question I have is, did the upstream, the person who owned that, not take on that vulnerability? Because underneath the program, let's say it's against Red Hat, that's in my scope. Our purpose in doing that is every vulnerability gets an identifier. They may not all be critical, but they all will get an identifier. And then that means we have to put the additional information in there. The problem then comes to being able to understand my code to what product and how do you identify it. And that's where the system breaks for me. So that's the part where we're trying to get past, is how do we do that? I see Ed's got his hand up, and then we have another one over here for Fang.
So our code also will provide CPE in the CVE record JSON. So I think your question is a kind of out of order, right? Because the scanner vendors provide CPE because they're not presented in the CVE record. If more vendor provide that, they will copy that directly. So I don't think they will generate their own if they're already presented somewhere.
She says yes and no, and yeah, we'll evidently do some walking. You should be on the panel.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I'm like CPEs, I am quite passionate about. I actually presented on CPEs just before this. But yes and no. Orca security, we use them. I'm from MongoDB. And we reached out to our vulnerability scanners to find out, where are they getting their CPEs? Because if they're not being added into the JSON files by the CNAs, where are they go, like who's providing that data, especially since, NVD is struggling with, keeping up with vuln enrichment. And you're right, we should be, as CNAs, be providing those product identifiers as not only a requirement, just so that CVE consumers know when or when not are they affected by the vulnerability. Now, I don't know if Orca themselves, they consolidate that information, but I think you mentioned that CPE dictionary hasn't been updated for a while, right? So like, is the information coming from the NVD APIs, but it's now no longer present? Or are they really pulling those JSON files from CVE org?
So we do use CPE for a long time. So the NVD CPE dictionary basically is single source of truth for a long time.
For a long
But-
time, but we've now,
But for here, I think the NVD should make a prediction. Do they want to copy the CPE from the CVE JSON record? I don't think they make that commitment yet. That means we'll make things very consistent between the CVE record and CPE dictionary. Chris Turner is here. We can ask him on Thursday because I talk. So your question is way ahead, right?
Yeah.
We need multiple parties to get agreement.
yes, yeah. So I'm just saying we need a single source of truth. Yeah.
I agree with that. And so I'm from Cisco. I work on the SBOM management platform. And I'm in charge of testing SCA tools. So I've tested NetRise, Anchor, Black Duck, a number of other tools, and they do all add CPE data to their CVE records. They pretend like they're NVD and they add stuff. They enrich. In fact, Anchor now has a CVE enrichment feed that purports to solve the problem of NVD. Like, you guys can go look it up and start feeding it in, because they open sourced it.
So the problem I have with most of those
I know.
is they don't follow the versioning very well.
No,
If they actually read our SBOMs and were taking those in, I haven't seen any of them who took an SBOM in yet. My folks can correct me if that's. So if they're not taking that in, then how do they know what are their components? And then how can they assign a CPE? And my biggest challenge is if I'm rebasing or I'm backporting, they certainly don't know what I'm doing.
no, they don't. But they,
And I could, ugly truth, we can get a component from upstream. And I can have 5 different backports for that.
okay, but you're from Red Hat. Red Hat provides security advisors. Anchor pulls in RHSAs. They pull in, Debian and Ubuntu security notices. Like,
But you know what? I'd say you're wrong, Anchor,
why would you say that?
because upon an RHSA, and they should be reading my BEX file. Because the RHSA is not detailed enough for what they need to do.
Really?
Yes,
Hmm.
that's the real problem is, I'm not going to name a vendor, but there's a vendor who pulls in RHSA. I can have 5 CVEs in there. One's a critical and the rest are moderate, and they will call 5 of them critical. Now, how are you doing real service there? And since you don't read the BEX file,
You're saying that Red Hat is rescoring vulnerabilities based on its usage in its product?
yes,
Interesting. So, and then you report backs and vendors?
yeah, our
report that.
severity level is based on how it's using the product or how it's protecting the product.
Okay,
So that means we're changing the base score. So we're not using CVSS as that harbinger of it. That's why sometimes we go back to NVD and say, we need to rescore, and here's why. But then we have to keep that on our website. But
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that a scanning vendor will go back and read that. Okay, they'll want to pull an NVD score, thinking that's the true, but they looked at it before with the rescore, because this rescore process is not quick. So now you have a disparity in the information.
That's true. And then there's EPSS. I would ask, do you know if they consider? your backs?
EPSS has a hard time reading open source very well.
Mhm.
Jay and I and Sasha have talked about that because I was a big believer trying to push that into Red Hat,
Yeah.
and I had to go back to my boss and say, I have to eat my words. It was not a nice thing I had to do, but it was honest.
Okay.
Yeah, my comment was just that in consuming the CVE data, it's difficult to tell from a CVE record whether the CNA is the owner of the product or not. Right. So you generally you have like, well, some CNAs are research CNAs. They publish a CVE record. They obviously don't own the product. Some are vendors. They own the product, but it's not clear in the record. And sometimes the vendor scope is both. And so then I don't know whether they're claiming to be authoritative owners of the product that they're saying is affected.
So I'll give you a couple examples. Example number one, Kernel. 731 CVEs, what was it, 2.5, 3 weeks ago? Of that, I don't remember the exact number. I think it was maybe 50 affected us. Now here's the problem in the system. And as a root, I'm addressing this with the open source CNAs. Well, I know, but you got to.
But there's two, I forgot to say, I also think that commercial and open source are different. So like if someone is like Microsoft, like I own Microsoft Word, I'm saying for sure I'm authoritative in Microsoft Word. Just having that would be useful for commercial vendors. Open source is extra tricky.
Well, yeah, I fall in that weird spot where one time I'm open source, another time I'm a proprietary, and it depends on some government agency that has 4 letters that says I'm one or the other and therefore I'm excluded. I don't like that, right? I look, I'm on both sides of that coin. But the issue is when you take it from upstream and you touch it and you move it, it becomes a different problem set. So that's where the score has to be is with the guy who moved it. So if Kernel's got one thing and I move it, oh, by the way, when we have these open source discussions, CNAs, that includes Microsoft Azure. That includes Oracle Linux. That includes, Debian, Ubuntu, Canonical, as well as Red Hat. So you have to realize that we all have to modify it. If you go further down, everyone else is still doing something else to it. So there's the problem where Anchor is pulling something that's probably a kernel, a CVSS. Greg will tell you, hey, I don't do CVSS because I don't do anything that makes it use anything. You do. So here's the problem.
Let me jump in real quick. Ed, I think you're Art's boss, right? I've seen this issue in our issues list. So I forgot to mention, I coordinate and chair the quality working group for CVE. And we do have an issue in that Art put in that talks about potentially having a property within the CVE record that defines whether it's the CNA is the authoritative source for this product or software. So that is something that we're talking about adding at some point. If anybody's interested in that or wants to talk about it more, that would be great. And even attending the QWG would be great as well if folks are interested. So hit me up if you want to potentially become a member.
Yeah, I just want to throw out that what I'm hearing is like the traditional sense of you have the code and you have a scanner that's assigning all this information. But I am a data scientist and I run a lot of tools and info gathering, and we use Anchor. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We use many different data sources, and the problem is that what you're suggesting requires that I have the code, and my use case, I absolutely don't. I get a list of like poorly constructed SBOMs and I have to guess what that is and make a mapping. And so for me, that data is useful. And so like, I guess I'm trying to get my head around, like, I mean, you're rescoring stuff, but like, and that's great. You use your data and all of that, but we also have huge information gaps and we got to fill them somehow.
You're hitting the real problem. We have a data issue. And how do we exchange that? I'm not expecting any scanning vendor to actually read my SBOMs. I would encourage it. My boss expects it. He and I have different expectations there. I do expect them to at least look at my VEX data. because my VEX data, you will actually see where my CPEs and Purls are. And then you'll see when I amended the code and I did 6 variations off that same problem set. And that's very important for you as a data scientist, because you're looking for that data. You want accuracy. So as it goes out our door, we're doing the SBOM, but we're aligning that code back into vuln management so our VEX keeps that same state. That's an important point there, because you want to know the state of every issue as it changes.
Yes, but how many vendors do VEX?
They're going to. No, seriously, we have, and Rogue and Martin can tell you, Martin, you want to talk about people who are looking at our VEX and how they're moving from that? No? That I'm putting them on the spot. Rogue will.
Hey, hold on. Bob's been waiting patiently for quite a while.
I've been waiting about 10 minutes. Seems to you like you guys are pretty into this topic, but I got only a couple points to make. Thank God I got out of vulnerability scanning years ago. The other point is, how the hell you fill up your data pool? Where do you get all this data from?
You mean you don't collect it?
Uh,
We do.
Are you getting everything?
Everything is, define what everything holds, define everything. Bruce, you can talk to my 2 experts here, Martin and Rogue, about how we actually pull that in. And it's in the release stream, as they're doing the build. So we're pulling it right there.
Well, I can guarantee you there's vendors out there that aren't contributing it.
I didn't say everyone. I don't take care of the world, but if you want good stuff, we could sell it to you. We'll talk to.
So should I cover that question about VEX?
Yes.
Yeah, so we cooperate with many scanning vendors, and from month to month, we see more feedback and questions from them how to consume our data, and they're asking for VEX because we need some kind of level of standardization and precise information. What exactly it is, what is the status. That's why I was presenting in the Open UX approach, where it will, again, improve the situation. Because, right now, anyone can produce SBOMs. And if we don't use the same connection through, for example, CPEs from SBOM in a VEX, and then also in the product identification, what exactly it is, it will be one big mess. And if vendors like Anhor, other scanning vendors, Aquasec, and so will use exactly the same data, not produce them by themselves, that will be a very big win.
So Oracle also provide VEX. If you download our CSAP documents, so it has a VEX information there for the CVEs. Red Hat also has it, yeah.
Yeah, Red Hat has it, yeah.
We need whatever we can get now. We can't, yeah, it's great. It's coming in the future, but like for right now, we have to use Anchor, other things. And so we're staying tuned and we're excited and support the VEX, but I'm just saying it's not in place right now. So it is super challenging. Yeah.
So CSAP will be a ISO document, ISO standard.
Mhm.
Hopefully we'll get more visibilities. More vendors will adopt CSAP. So that's why they can provide VEX. So do have a follow-up question for piece, CVSS modification. I'm in the first CVSS 6. So the 6th official position, you don't need to change the base score. You don't need to modify the base score. You can use the environmental score. to add more
It's not the
information.
base score, having created that beast. It's temporal, really. And the problem is no one has actually done temporal for 3.1. So the question is in 4 and 4.1, we will be moving into that area. And that's where I think we have to change as an industry, because everyone has always gone with the base score in 1, 2, 3, and 3.1. And that's wrong. We've been wrong since that was invented.
Yeah, that's a fact, hard truth, right? Nobody actually using
Yeah.
elementary and also now called Thread metrics.
Right. So
4.0.
that's where we've got to make a change because everyone's gotten used to base score. And you're right, it's supposed to be immutable. I remember when I said that word the first time in the SIG, you know, it's supposed to be immutable. And yet everyone has made it more temporal than it should be. So, okay, we're maturing. We're going to get that. But we have to start with VEX somewhere. And the question that you're going to see on Thursday in the BOF is false positives. What do we as an industry do to work with security vendors and help them? That's going to be the open question for Thursday afternoon.
I have a quick question about what you just said. That was intriguing to me. Why do you think temporality is a problem? Why do you think that we should not make exploitability part of the score? And that's very temporal.
So you have the base score. The question is, should we also be doing a temporal score?
Yeah.
Because that's where the exploitability is, and that's where actually patching and other configuration mitigations should be at. It's in the temporal score, not in the base score. But over time, everyone's used the base score solely. And the question is, well, if it's being used differently, why didn't we do a temporal? But everyone only has allowed and coded for that one score, which is the problem.
Well, why do you say people have gone more temporal than they should have? What did you mean by that?
Because when we did CVSS V1, and we made a base temporal and environmental, is because there were 4-point, 5-point, 10-point, and then CERT CC with 20 to 180 scales. And we're looking for a common way to do it. So we made base as a way to say this is the immutable score. And we thought everyone would do temporal themselves and environmental themselves.
Mhm.
The security industry didn't pick up on the temporal part.
Okay.
The customer didn't do environmental part. And so everything reverted back to the quote immutable base score. And that's where we went wrong. We didn't enforce that because we're looking for adoption.
Okay.
And that was, you know, retrospect almost 20 years, I'm going, oh, we missed the opportunity. I had to clean that one up.
So Red Hat is doing the in-between thing, which is providing the like running on with score.
So
You
when we
did
score it,
fire-
okay, we actually rescore the base score to make sure it's correct. Because not everyone looks at that and understands it. And then we do a severity score. By the way, so does like Huawei and Microsoft. And that severity score is what we do as to whether or not we prioritize a fix.
Mhm.
So notice that
It's just
we're
not
not using
obvious.
CVSS to say this is a fix or not.
But you don't put that information in the security notices. Why not?
It's on our website already.
Okay,
So in our life cycle, it'll say we will fix all critical and important
right,
and KEVs.
right. But you don't, it's not easy to find why you prioritize some fixes over others. Like you're not very transparent about it. No offense.
Yeah, we have lots of documentation, blogs, KBs, presentations, all on the net, YouTube channels, and we talk to customers about that all the time. It's right there on our severity page. And
I do read that page multiple times. It's very unclear how you basically map into that category in many times. You do have some secret formula somewhere to do that. I understand.
yeah, because you have to get into the belly of the software. But I think you'll see the changes in CVSS V4 because the string will be different and it'll be more inclusive of the temporal. So I didn't make it about all Red Hat, sorry. Stunned silence. Anything on Discord yet? So what are we trying to say here is CPE and the extension of CPE with whatever additional language so we can be specific about the component is the key to understanding whether or not you may be at risk or not. And then from a CVE perspective, it's how complete does that record have to be for a CNA to be authoritative? That's the recognition part we're trying to get to. And that's the scoring part we're trying to figure out because we don't know the complete answer on that. Go ahead, Christina, I can see that
I
question.
mean, we don't have any representatives here from Ubuntu, so I'm just gonna keep attacking Red Hat. No offense. I met someone from Canonical earlier, but he's not in the room, so, you know.
That's all right. We talk with them.
So, in the earlier discussion today, someone from MITRE was talking about, you know, the plan to potentially add Purls as an option to CVE records. Does Red Hat have any plans to adopt Purls as like an additional identifier, as sort of a,
Martin,
like
you
a
have to talk.
nested identifier? I mean, this is the topic of this talk, right?
The answer is yes.
So in your, whether it's VEX or
I could've
security
said that.
notices.
My
the
voice is a
plan
little
is
shaky. Sorry.
to like nest some Purls in there in addition to the CPE assignments.
So come to my talk tomorrow at 11. I explain all of this in detail. But we do use CPEs. We use them as product identifiers, not really as component identifiers. So we're actually still stuck on using the 2.2 version of CPE. And then we use Purls for identifying components. So any piece of software that acts as a package component, whatever, it has its own Purl.
So what you're saying is that you will use a combination of CPE and Purl?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
We already do.
Have been for a while.
Will you be discussing at that talk how you are going to plan to identify version ranges, et cetera, using Purl?
I can.
Okay.
I'll add a slide for you.
And Martin made a distinction there because people talking CPEs and products for CVEs. Notice we like scoring components internally. So that's why there's Purl. That's why we do both.
Sorry, I do, I have a question over here. Well, I don't know if it's a question. So, MongoDB, we are CNA, and it's really helpful to hear how like Red Hat and other vulnerability scanners are, utilizing CPEs or Purls. The thing is, we would like to know this as CNA so we can provide as much information as possible from the very beginning, right? So that vulnerability scanners can read our CVEs and making sure our customers and our users are, being fixed for any issues. So is there going to be, and I don't know if the CVE program should be mandating this, right? But I guess there just needs to be guidance for like us, the smaller CNAs who want to be, helpful in the industry and provide the right information from the very beginning, because the number of CNAs being added every year, it's just growing. I think like in the last few years, I think the number of CNAs being added will hit 100 by 2020, end of 2025.
477.
Yeah, we're 447, but
447.
every year we haven't reached 100 yet in terms of
Okay.
per year. And I
Okay.
think last year was 88. So this year will probably be 100. So that will bring that to 500 something, right? So as new CNAs are being added, that guidance should be provided, right? And I think I had to do a lot of digging in terms of finding out how vulnerability scanners use the CVEs for identification. Product identification, right?
So I think it's clear what the information that's required, but I think what you're asking and what I'm hearing is that you need better guidance on what's the recommended data that you should be providing and what we think would be best case for you, right?
Yeah, and like, what are vulnerability scanners doing in terms of, because, CPEs haven't been historically very well known, and they've not been added by CNAs themselves. So what are they doing? What sources are they using? And what can CNAs be doing to help the vulnerability scanners? Because at the end of the day, we're all part of the same industry. And we want to make sure that
you do the right thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think if you take a look at some of the SEA tools that are out there, like SIFT, they just make it up on the spot, right? They look at the system, they observe it, they figure out some of the attributes of what they're looking at, and then they compile together an identifier, a CPE, Purl, whatever, right? There is no other way for them to do this unless you actually attach the identity to the component that you're looking at. Then they have to make it out of thin air, right? So to make that better, is essentially we all have to come to the same table and make sure that the way we use these identifiers is standardized across the industry, right? The way I use Purl and the way you use Purl must be the same, right? And
Exactly.
we actually, Red Hat actually published a set of Purl guidelines that literally outline in a very detailed manner of this is how we use Purl for Red Hat specific components. So if it's an RPM, this is the qualifiers that we use. You can expect these values in it. If it's a, I don't know, a Maven jar, here's how we name it, here is how we version it and all that, right?
Yeah, but it's still not a very common identifier. I think, again, I keep pointing back to Andrew's talk from yesterday from BlackBerry, and I think he said that only 2 CVEs out there have Purls in them. So it's, yes, providing guidance, but also that standardization, that structure needs to be there, because otherwise, we have all this data. Yes, we're, other metadata like CVSS and CWEs, they're all being added into CVEs, but there's nothing to tie it to. You have that really good information out there, but it's just floating. It's not tied to a
But
product or a version.
I think that's just a matter of getting the CNAs to do it
Yes,
right,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And so you asked earlier, like as a CNA, as MongoDB, how can you make it easier for us downstream consumers to recognize your identity, right? Because I think Red Hat does ship MongoDB as part of RHEL.
Yeah.
And it's literally just like filling out the CVE records with correct and predictable information, right? Put the right identifiers in there and things will just work, right? That of course assumes that, for example, the CVE records don't fully support Purls yet, right? So we have to wait for that a little bit. They do support the CPE applicability statements. You can start using those, and that'll improve it. But I guess what we really just have to get away from is the CNAs that will publish a record and it'll have product equals NA.
Yeah.
That's the big problem here.
So he's right. And something I was going to add real quick. Sorry, Rob. The CP applicability format that we talked about in the previous presentation, there is a proposal in the QWG right now to use a very similar structure to support Purl identifiers in a more official way using the applicability language. So that is another thing that the QWG is currently working towards. So that could be coming down the road. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, so like Martin said, if you include as a CNA to your CVE record information about your product by CPE, right? We'll use it internally at Red Hat. Then right now, very soon we will start adding CPE information and other metadata to our, for example, container images. So scanning vendor who scanned container image with MongoDB we took from you will see that, okay, this is a component and associated CPE ID is this one. So I know what exactly it is. And in this case, they will know that they should use our CPE because this is the component that they are scanning and go to Red Hat CVE record and in the CSAP VEX advisories and they consume it from our side. So they will know, okay, this is the status for this component that I'm scanning right now, instead of going to upstream data and using your CPE ID that can bring incorrect information about the status, because there could be a CVE that affects MongoDB, but the way how we use it in our component could be a completely different story.
So is it just providing the CPE like a string, or are you saying we can just have fill in affected product and version as not in the CPE? Because you can list out the affected product and version just in the schema itself rather than providing the CPE. Is that enough, or should we be adding those CPEs? Should be both. Yeah, because if you're already filling in that section, you should be able to fill in the CPE, right? Yeah. And as CPEs become more common, I think there's loads of people out there or organizations out there that have internal tools to develop CPEs for their products, right? Based on the CVEs that they've created. But because it's not commonly known in the industry, those tools aren't available for our smaller CNAs who would love to be involved and, aren't really sure how to create a CPE themselves. I mean, it does take a little bit of learning to understand the schema, but yeah, I think it's just bringing that awareness.
The beginning and adoption takes some time, but when you pass it, then it's easy.
So I've evaluated a lot of SCA tools in my work at Cisco. I've been there for like 6 years, and Cisco itself has had an SBOM management platform based on SCA tools since 2014. I can't say a lot about those tools without like breaking NDAs, but I can talk a little bit about how we have handled the naming problem internally. So 7 years ago, we started what's called alias service, which had its flaws. It still has its flaws. But it was basically the idea that there's always going to be different names for software packages on different platforms. And so in 2018, we created alias service to map those names together, to tie them together, right? As a sort of nested array of like how names are tied together across different platforms. NVD has its own name, right? Red Hat has its own name. Those two things are tied together. So that was mostly for tracking for licensing purposes, but somewhat also for CVE purposes. And I think of, and I'm going to talk about Anchor only because most of it is open sourced, right? You all know that they have like 15 different feeds that are coming from, you know, different places, and they're trying to tie all that data together. They have a similar idea, but it's sort of more open-ended in terms of like they can add Purls. They add lots of Purls to a lot of their what they call artifacts sometimes. But you have to be very specific about where you want the feed to go to and which name you want to use on that feed. And I sort of imagine that if MITRE could accomplish this, it would sort of look the same way. We'd have like a CPE name that was tied to Purls, right, together, or whatever identifier, like maybe, I don't want to say the forbidden word of Omnivore, but like tied to, you know, artifacts that come from Omnivore in a sort of like parent-child way as it goes down. That's my personal suggestion based on my experience.
It's the CVE program, not MITRE.
Sure.
People
Okay,
under-
sorry. Sure. I still don't understand how they're different, honestly.
Okay.
So to give more information about CPEs, we have been using CPE for a long time. So starting point, the CPE 2003, if you read back using CPE the string, and you find out has many weaknesses in that string. Special characters, versions cannot be actually addressed by that old standard. That's why NVD moved from string to the JSON workaround. They put version ending, version starting, this kind of thing to cover version ranges. So as a group, we should push NIST to design the next version of CPE. The CPE 2003 basically totally out of date, cannot be used. So we should have some new modern schema like JSON based. So that's why we can do the mapping between CPE to Purl to other identifiers.
You know, the challenge of about trashing one and going the other is the crossover and cost of tooling. Certainly an option, but it would disrupt heavily. So the question really was, how do we amend and grow it, extend it to account for most of what we're doing? That was the approach from the CVE program about doing that. The difference is MITRE is an FFRDC and has secretariat duties to the program. And the program run by the board pushes out where we're trying to go. The question we're trying to figure out, we're both board members also, is what constitutes a CVE record? So Art's question yesterday was actually very apropos. What is a minimum record? Okay, then what is an ideal record? I could envision at some point you could say, do we tier those CNAs? Or if you can't get there, you don't become a CNA, but you can get CVEs. Notice that's a change in thought process. So when I hear, you know, agencies talk about, well, we're recruiting, what are we recruiting? Another CNA? Well, so what? Let's have quality. So it's about the record, not about the CNA. And that's a thought process change we all need to think about is a CNA is a trusted entity who repeatedly does this. The question is, define this. And that's what we're trying to figure out.
So the minimum requirement should be put into the JSON schema, the required field, right? Makes that very clear, right? If you submit the record, you should have this kind of field presented. Probably audit for the high qualities.
Okay, there we go. So I'm Andrew with MITRE, part of the Omnivore core team, and also I'm the person who's formally submitted the proposals to add Purl and Omnivore to the CVE record format. One thing I want to just make clear is that, because I heard a couple times like ideas for improvement to CPE or to Purl, certainly, always room for improvement, but I know with the QWG, the goal is not to workshop the identifier formats and make improvements to them. It's a question of use or not use. So where there's, ideas of like, oh, CPE could be improved in various ways, or where, concerns with the state of 2.3, which was, written quite a while ago. Those are all great, but at least from the perspective of CVE, like the sort of boundary has been set to say, look, like CVE is not sort of reaching out and like solving the identifier formats, but is instead deciding, does it make sense to add these to the record format so that they can be used for specifying the applicability constraints and sort of enabling cross-referencing and like the other benefits.
Were you going to answer that?
Oh, no. Just
I don't mean to dominate the conversation. I will say this, and I think it was talked about a little bit in the earlier session. I think Omnivore does have value in that it sort of does cover a space that Purl does not cover. And like you said, being able to add VEX documents that specify, specific Omnivore records that might be underneath a CPE record, that would be useful, to say, well, this isn't in a package manager ecosystem, but this particular artifact has this score, as is.
I want to go back to something Martin spoke to, is the CPE is more towards the application. And we're using Purl towards the components.
CPE can be covered part of it too.
It could.
Yeah, CPE could cover both, although Purl seems to be more package module specific, right?
Yeah. So the thing you have to think through there is, where are we going to go? And that's more of an open question. I mean, that's really what was just said, is where do we go? That's what Martin was pointing to, is we need to be standard. That wasn't, this is the standard. That is, we need to be standard. We need to go there. If we all shift that way and become the standard, that really helps us move forward. And that's the consideration we're trying to get you all to think through.
I do have an observation that might lead to a question. I observed that things are moving fast. We were talking about CVE, now we're talking about CPE, and then more and more. And then we talk about data as well. If the more data we have, the more correct information we will have. So what the community is doing to bring more data or more people to share the data, because there are organizations out there, they are not willing to share the data. Last year, there was one speaker from China talking about what China is doing to reinforce organization to provide the data to the government, not even to what NVD is thinking about that, or us as a committee to bring more people and then to share more data, thinking about regulations or things.
But I think what you do see is like the lady from Mozilla, she's willing to share more data. She wants to know how best to do that. I think we need to, on the QWG and with the CVE record format, we're trying to find ways to facilitate that and to let people bring that data out in a way that makes the most sense for data consumers. So I think that's what all this boils down to.
It goes to the question at the opening I asked. Okay. We say ecosystem, but we haven't defined what that is or how we work together. And you're right, it's a data problem. We have a huge data issue. We have to figure out what pieces are required. And then how do we make those elements collaborate together? Not just communicate, we have to collaborate. Because if we're not all pulling that same outcome, it's going to be too disjointed. And then we'll miss the opportunity of capturing a way to inform that scanning vendors can use to inform their customers, which are our customers. So realize that has to be more symbiotic. So we have to determine, okay, if CVE is the identifier, just use that for the moment. I know some people have other things they want to do, but if that's identifier, then what is a record? Okay, what is really important for the consumer? If we can minimally define that, then we have something, as Mark put to, that we can standardize on. That's what we don't have. We don't have that standardization. So what we're going to do is kind of pick up for where we left off earlier before lunch. Those of us who got to eat, some of us gabbed for a while, and we got, I don't know, slim pickings would be an overstatement. We can't be that close together. So what we want to do is some of the concepts we came out with in that discussion, we'd like to go ahead and capture some of those as ideas to consider. And pardon me for some of the discussion we had, Chris and I, with some people who stuck around afterwards, because they gave us some feedback about items we could do. So I'm going to try to recap a couple items, not to be all inclusive, just to start the conversation. And yes, we have mics for you guys to share. Last time we were short on mics. This time I think we have too many. We were talking about in CPE how we could extend CPE and how we could extend then for Purl. The CPE part of the extension has already started. The quality work group and the automation work group are working hard with that. We're conversing with Chris Turner, who's also representing NVD and NIST on the CVE board about that extension. One of the things we talked about, and the concept is we all need to move in the same direction to get adoption. So the question would be, or the statement, I guess, would be, we want to move rapidly forward on extending CPE and then adding Purl. So I think that's one of the outcomes that we would start with. Okay, Chris? Yep. And then what does it mean to do that? That's going to be the big question past that. What's it mean to do that? And some of us have already started. Microsoft's done some things. Red Hat's doing some things. I think MongoDB has some nice ideas. She's not here right now. Hopefully she comes in a little bit. Some others have other ideas. The key, because we actually had some vendors, security scanning vendors in the crowd, is they're looking for a good aggregation point to pull from. Put it another way, maybe a little more blunt, is they're looking for an easy way to get the data and stop the crisscross between customers, producers, and other vendors, security vendors. I think that's a fair way of putting it. So How do we do that? The interesting point is I asked Tanya, because Tanya Brewer from NVD was here, the director at NVD, hey, is CPE dictionary required by law? To which I got a surprising answer, no. I went, oh, I thought that you told us last year. So, seems to me that maybe we're looking at this wrong about how we update that CPE dictionary. Not that I'm trying to supersede NVD, but from an ecosystem perspective, how do we make that work? Because the point of the problem right now, everyone mentioned, was we have a data problem. And in that data problem, we have a data format problem. How do we inform? So I'm using that as an open premise, and I can see you guys had all that food I missed because you're ready to go to sleep and not give me an answer, which means I now have to call on you if you don't volunteer. So anyone want to react to that? Christine, I'm counting on you. Hold on a second. We'll get that mic for.
Gonna say, we should have just recorded the previous session and put all that down on Scratchpad, just to start with this. So, the gentleman, who's from Oracle.
Fang. His
Yeah,
boss is here now.
oh, okay.
Bruce is behind you.
Hey, how's it going? So, he talked a little bit about the JSON format, and maybe this isn't the place to get into the nitty gritty of the formatting that we do, but maybe it is the place to get into it. I talked about nesting data, but he actually had ideas on how you might nest that data in a JSON structure, how you would tie Purls to CPEs. Is that something
So
we want to get
let's
into?
record that that's an idea.
Okay.
Okay, and I want to let Bruce talk that in a second.
Just a second. The guy's name that did that is named Fung.
Fun,
spelled
I
Fang.
mispronounced it.
Everybody mispronounces it. It's Fung and everybody says Fang because that's the way it looks in English. Okay, I just wanted to say that. So, I'm not the one I'm not saying he's wrong or anything. I didn't promote that. That's
No.
not me.
That's okay. I think it's a good idea that we need to bring forward. Not to try to solution it here. I think what we're trying to figure out is what are the approaches that we could consider and who might have those ideas for all of us to look at.
I don't
So-
know that anyone has ever had that idea, like solution from the ground up. Each vendor tries to create their own internal solution, and they all have different formats internally that they try to then tie to external formats. Because there is no one point.
No, there isn't.
Yeah.
And that's why I looked at, we need to bring them forward because I know Microsoft has brought forward what they're doing. I know that Red Hat, we've taken our stuff forward. I'm not going to claim any one of us has, quote, the answer. We have starting points. And where's the commonality? I think commonality is key because it's faster to adoption. And as someone postulated in the last session, do we start over? And I think the problem with start over is it's like, okay, 2 to 3 years to kind of get anything, and then another 2 years to get adoption. And by the way, all the tooling we'd all have to do. I'd rather extend, if possible, what's already existent and amend what our differences are that we could make it more broad, acceptable. I don't know what that trade-off is. That's a conversation that's going to have to take place, I think, in technical terms about how we do that.
Well, there's a good question. What is Red Hat doing internally? Like, what do your formats look like?
So actually,
Start
Martin is
with-
presenting on some of that this afternoon. So I want to ask you to go and see him. But like he said earlier, we use CPE at the application level, but we use Purl at the component level. So you have to realize we probably do a little different. We didn't mean to be different. It's just what we do. When we assign a CVE, we actually go to the component and then we search for where the component is in the applications and then where the dependencies are, where it's stacked above that. So internally, we look at components. Externally, because everyone talks applications to CVEs, because that's the way they saw everyone else, we translate that across for people to do that. But if you look at our VEX file, it'll contain both the CPE, the application level, and then the Purl down to the component level, and they both have the CVE.
I have a question because I feel like we're not talking apples to apples when you say components. When you say
Packages
application-
upstream, yeah.
Yeah, packages. See, when you say components, you mean packages, but when say Cisco says components, we mean, you know, applications, or can mean both.
So, okay, there's a point we need to put on the scratch pad is make sure that we're using the definition similarly, or at least we know when we're translating back across. Bruce?
So there's a number of problems, and it would be good to put them down somewhere so people can start thinking about them, because people come and do, I'll answer this, I'll address your issue, but I wanted to bring up something else first. There's people that are saying Purl solve all known problems. Okay. And there's people that say that. Tom Aldridge is one, to pick one. But they don't support version ranges. So, you know, they don't solve all known problems. They don't solve problems of products that don't use packages. And that's a lot of products. So what we're talking about here is a problem where there's a vulnerability that where do you get the fix? And that's in the product. But what is vulnerable is a component. Okay, and you need to support both. If the instructions were, let's use CPE for the product and Purl for the component, and it was clear that that's what you were doing, that would help everybody because of, you know, of a couple of reasons. And one thing you'll notice in the, I don't know if you've looked in the CVE entries, you'll figure out that if you look at the vendor and product fields in the CVE org entries, they're often different than if a CPE is provided, the vendor and product in the CPE. And nobody knows what that means. Is it just different parts of the company use different names? There's no rigor anywhere. What's going on? If the answer is we're talking about the component that's vulnerable, not the product, and the way I think about it is, what's the product that's patched versus what's the product that has the vulnerability? Now, maybe that's the wrong way, but that's the way I've been thinking about it. I'm happy to comply with whatever you know, I want to be standardized. That helps everybody. But that's what I see the difference. I don't know is that what you guys are doing with CPE versus CV versus Purls, or do you know, or is it anarchy?
Oh, I was just about to tell you the infamous, it depends. Okay, so if we had a problem in a package component of REL, okay, then the question is it in the container that's an OpenShift? Or is it in the package underneath that container of OpenShift? Because scanning vendors will look at it as being the same. It's not. And it really depends on the version level of those two.
Ouch.
Oh, that hurt. I'm good. All I do is put it in my pocket now. Hold it. I'm not trusting that belt loop anymore. Of how we package that and how they're using it. So it depends on both ways, because notice once it's in the container, it's listed differently. It's listed then as a component. Where if it's REL, it's listed as a application. So you get Purl in one and CPE in the other, and they're totally seen differently by a scanning vendor. And that's part of the problem. And I think you kind of identified it, is what do we mean? In some ways, what you're talking, Bruce, it kind of made me think of, do I need to publish a key, a generic key of how to read that? I didn't think of it before. Go ahead, Ed. You need, I might give a second.
I just wanted to highlight how big of a problem I think that is. You know, it's one thing if you're the vendor, you know what your stuff is. But if you have to like enrich, let's say you have to enrich the record for some reason, and you have to figure out what the product is, and you go to the vendor's website and they don't say the same thing, you can only use public references, then it's tricky. And you end up, it's hard to maintain a database that way. So that's a real problem. So if the vendors could say what their products are, right, that would be helpful. It's difficult, I know, but it slows things down a lot.
No,
'Cause
you
then
make
just
me,
have to guess.
yeah, you're making me think a little bit differently in this conversation, because now it goes back to what the EOX is. And this mic is not going to work well with me, I can tell. In what, you know, if you look at my CVE pages, you're gonna get one story. You're gonna get initially, because we publish usually within like 3 days of an issue. And it's usually faster than that, but 3 days is my max. I'm gonna tell you OpenShift 4.x. And it's not until I publish an errata are you gonna see the update of 4.12, 4.14, 4.16, right? But that still doesn't give you the level of detail that you're really looking for, which is where the VEX file is. However, when I publish the errata is accompanied by a Red Hat Security Advisory, which enumerates all the CVEs in there, which means you have multiple different CVEs in that same errata. And now they each have different scoring levels, which again, go back to if it's an OpenShift, I have a Red Hat, a RHEL, a different problem set yet again on what that scoring level is. So it really goes to how it's used in the product, which goes back to that temporal problem. What I'm trying to do is map my mind through how I answer that information that Ed just asked me about, which I have security vendors, some, I guess they're not here right now, some pull from the CVE pages, some pull from the RHSAs, some pull from NVD, most of them, some pull from CVE, a few of them, and then there's some who actually read my VEX files. I never walked my way through that until just now.
And then think of, if you happen to be the NVD, which one are you supposed to pick? Right. And what, you know.
According to NVD, they say that they pull from CVE.org as their upstream. That's what Tanya
Right.
said 3 times last year.
But sometimes the CVE will say something in product affected, something different. It's just hard to come up with the name. And then if it doesn't say, you go to the vendor's website and they give a list of products, but their marketing material is different than their other material, and you need a public reference, and which one do you use? Right. It's tricky, right?
Is it George?
Well, no, just like all CVEs, right? Like, what are all the products, right? You know, so actually, like, you know,
Right.
Red Hat's I have a lot to pick from, right? So a lot of them I don't, right? There's nothing there. I don't know what the
I'm an
products are.
easy target to
Right.
talk to because
Yes.
it's out there. And that's fair, because that's why we believe in open and transparent.
But that's why I was asking you before about, like, are you selling it? Are you the vendor? Then you can say, this is definitively the names I use for the things.
Right.
If I go into help about, that's the name that's going to be there. So like, it's all public and we know what it is, so it can be consistent. Because if it's not public, then how do you pick what the name of the thing is? You think it would be easy. It is not easy. There's many, many examples where I do not know what the name of it is. And sometimes people change the names, which of course they're allowed to, right? But then do you go back and change everything? And
No,
names are hard.
I had that problem internally, you know. I mean, just Red Hat is what Red Hat Inc., you know. Of course, we name all our products RH something. For some odd reason, I haven't figured it out.
So I'll just say that for this specific problem, like pulling from library science, this problem is the problem of controlled ontologies, which CPE is a controlled ontology, and there is a pretty substantial library science literature of how do you deal with trying to resolve what the canonical name is for something. And in this particular system, like I think the idea would be that the CPE dictionary is supposed to be the authoritative source of what the official name is for something. And the point of conflict both is when you are introducing new names and sort of who has the authority to issue directives to CPE to say like, hey, can you add this thing to the dictionary? And also dealing with things like renames, like we're talking product renames. How do you deal with resolving the new name or having interlinking between the two? But I think the idea is that CPE is supposed to be the dictionary is supposed to be the authoritative answer.
Let's talk to where that's a problem.
The CPE dictionary is not a dictionary. It's just a list of all the CPEs ever issued. There's no mapping between the CPE dictionary and a product. Right? There isn't. Or a vendor. There's no mapping anywhere. You can't look at the CPE dictionary and find out that it's IBM. You just have to guess it because it says IBM or International Business Machine or International Business Machine Inc. or something like that. The other thing is vendors were not allowed to make CPEs, right? Only NVD could make them. The reason that vendors, and I'm just speaking for us, but which is Oracle, but it seems to be true of everybody. We weren't issuing CPEs is because NVD wouldn't allow it. Okay, now you would think that the vendor would know more about what the products are than somebody else, like what the product names are, but that's not the way CPEs work. And the reason I said worked is because they're not getting assigned much anymore, right? In the last, in NVD. So I think this year, the biggest month has been 1/3 of the CVEs got at least one CPE. You know, that's the biggest percentage this year. And, you know, basically since February of last year, they've not gotten above like 70%. Usually it was around 40 or less of the CVEs got at least one CPE assigned to it. Now they're putting out statistics and things like that in their dashboard that are misleading. That say they're enriching, you know, like 80% of them. But if you care about the CPE part, we're down to 1/3 or less, and mostly less. So you can't depend on them for that. And we'd like to go someplace where we can depend on them. Hopefully the CVE org will do that for us. And we're looking to that or somebody else. But that dictionary is completely misnamed, the CPE dictionary. Furthermore, well, when things change names, there's an indication that happened, that this CPE is the same product as that CPE, even though they've got different IDs in the vendor and product area. So, you know, there's none of that going on there. You can't, that's not something you can use. Does anyone disagree? Yeah, I would tell you that we have a legal dictionary for licenses, and you're supposed to, whenever you're going to use a new component, you have to put the name of the component, the name of the Oracle product. And I can tell you, it's a hell of a lot harder for me to figure out the Oracle product than it is the third-party product. Because there's, you know, it's just anarchy. We're working on fixing that, and I completely understand his issue where you can't figure out what the product name is, because I can't either. And I know that, you know, and I work there.
Yeah, I just see if you move the problem, you just have the same problem in CVE land unless you do something about the authoritative part of like who has the name, and then do we go back and change old records? Right. I mean, those issues are, I think, the things that have slowed down the NVD. And so if come up with a new system and you don't address those, then it's just the same thing all over again. Right.
I'm gonna go with you about the authoritative record. In fact, it's probably for the scratch pad, we have to be more definitive about the authoritative record.
I guess the other thing there wasn't a bunch of CNAs, right? So
Correct.
A bunch of this problem is because in the beginning it was different, and then we expanded it, but it was voluntary and then everyone wasn't doing all the stuff. So still like, who do you rely on for what thing if there aren't mandatory fields? Right.
So what that points to, Ed, and something we talked on the extended in the lunch conversation was the maturation of processes at different rates within the entire ecosystem and not being collaborative in our objectives. Okay, trying to be careful how I pick those words. It's not that we didn't sometimes communicate because we were cross groups, but it didn't mean that the groups were talking to each other and had any tie off. So when you get to that problem about naming, it becomes a real problem. And I'll pick on as an example. If you just said rel, okay, what version? And you know, you could say, I'll just say rel 8. Okay, what is actually an active support? Well, it's above 8.8 and above. Okay, so you can't say rel 8 for a CPE because there's a difference between 8.8 and 8.6 of pretty significant proportion. Not as bad as going to rel 9, which of course is totally different. Yes.
I hate to bring up alias service again because I really hate it. Jonathan can attest to that. He hates it even more than I do, but any solution has got to have some an actual, you know, cross correlation, cross mapping between old names, new names, names in different package managers, names from different scan engines. Like for example, we have supplier and distro aliasing. Rel has like 10 different names associated with, it all gets aliased to rel. I'm just saying, like, you got to have that mapping, and any new system that we create is going to have a mapping to older CPEs if they change names. And I have yet another point to make that's even more related to that, because it's, I don't want to give away the.
Can you hold that one for a second?
Sure.
Because my brain won't hold what I already has. I'm on an 8080 processor, so
Right.
buffer's already crashed. I think there's a key, there's a mapping, and I already forgot the third one. Damn it. Okay, go. Is Discord?
The Discord question from Andrew Suter. He says, I think this is where delegating the CPE dictionary out in a CNA-like manner would help. Vendors can then make updates themselves within a defined scope. But there's still the question of what value it really brings, the CPE dictionary. Is it worth having?
Wow, that's a big debatable point. Let's say that we need a dictionary that we can all go to and refer from. It's like the one point you go to for a piece of that kind of data. Now, I'm going to presuppose that whoever's the authoritative source needs to be able to feed that in a common way. If we do that, then CPE is required. But to go with that, you actually need something like EOX, because you have to know the life cycle of the problem set so that the name knows when it's no longer supported, which goes to an end of life problem set that we're experiencing, like with Node.js. Okay, that's a CVE challenge, but it's really an ecosystem problem. So we have to be able to collaborate those to work together so we are answering the question in full instead of in part. That's Pete's opinion of that. Ed, you want to add to that?
If I could pick one thing, it's really like three parts. The first part is there's a CNA registry, and CNAs can put references there, right? Like this is our security contact, this whatever, right? And then they could post, this is what we call all of our stuff. Like this is the authoritative list of all of our stuff. So if somebody doesn't use that list and they're not doing then you could just look and be like, hey, the vendor said it's called this and you're not calling it that. Right. But it has to be somewhere that, like, you know, our marketing material says this, over here says this, over here says this, but this is the one we mean for CVEs. Like this is what we're calling it. Right. That if I could just, you know, make everybody do something.
You just made my head hurt. Yeah, because what you just said is every upstream package has to have some kind of name so that when some organization like mine pulls it down and we put it in our SBOM, we call it the same thing so that when we do our errata, we actually use that name. Right?
I think is it MZ that's brought up having some kind of DNS-like lookup for that exact thing?
We need a lookup. I'll leave the DNS out because that just triggers geographic wars that we don't need.
Well, one was I was going to agree a little bit with the like a name service like lookup. So we have an open source project called Guac underneath the OpenSSF. Does a lot of stuff in this space. I think one of the biggest challenges we have, and also security vendor, is around understanding how do I look up that name? How do I like if like when we get CPEs or we get Purls in particular, one of the biggest challenges is it's potentially a many-to-many mapping, especially if we kind of look even outside of vendors and we start to look at the open source stuff, we end up seeing that one Purl is ambiguous or it could be ambiguous. Sometimes you get enough information in the Purl to know that it specifically points to that, but then you could still have multiple Purls that point to one sort of piece of software, package, component, whatever you want to call it. And then vice versa, if you're kind of, if I'm given, I have some piece of software here, what does that map back to? Can also be quite ambiguous. And without having some canonical way of going back to whether it's a dictionary or whether it's essentially like a DNS lookup or something like that, it could be very, very complicated. And then made even more so when somebody comes in and let's say rename something. And sometimes it's not even necessarily renaming. It's just as simple as somebody capitalized a G or something like that. And then all of a sudden, everything downstream breaks.
We're experiencing that using Guac right now, and we have a new contribution coming that I think you're probably
Yes.
yeah. So not that that's going to solve everything.
Yeah, I know.
This is where you get to the hairy details. Why I don't want to try to solution it here, but it gives you an idea of the depth of the problem set because we never set guidelines up at the beginning, and then we didn't deconflict our approaches. So we're into the hairy bag of how do we back out to some point that we find acceptable by project, which is really that's a terrible way to do it because like everyone then quote has a vote, and I don't think that works. Sorry, I've been on too many goat ropes. So we've got to find a way to do that. Go ahead.
Another question on Discord from Tom. He asks, what if different people within the company use different names for the product? That happens all the time.
So you have to have, who is that source of truth? No, I am of the belief that it's the security team for product. And I say that because we are the ones that have to track the problem and assign that it needs to be done and communicate externally. And if you're going to tie your VEX statement to where your SBOM is, then you need to be signing off on your SBOM that is the release that you're supporting and you're doing your vuln management again. So you use the same terms. Now, does that mean that term is consistent from product to product? Not necessarily, but it has to be consistent within the product.
Also, they won't capitalize weird things or put dashes or spaces in places like marketing one. That's another thing.
That's a naming convention problem set that we're trying to work our way through because we're using Guac and we're running into a bunch of problems internally for how we manifest everything. And you'll hear me talk internally as manifest. I call externally an SBOM because that's when you add licensing and a bunch of other stuff. And I see that as a static file. But my VEX has got to be tied to that. And we're trying to, I don't know if we work with you guys on this, cryptographically linking those. Okay. You got to. And that's why I say it's got to be the security team, because more often than not, people might hash it or they might sign it, but they don't necessarily link it in a way a security team will think of it. And that's what the vuln scanner community looks for. That's what the customer looks for. Remember the old days when we used to PGP sign everything? That's still the mentality. Bruce, you got something?
Yeah, a key problem is just getting the vendor name. If we could get the vendor name, that would help. At least I could ask the vendor what the name of their products was. Right now, there's a name you could get from CVE.org for everybody that ever assigned a CVE. Right? There's a short form or something. We could all decide we'll use the short form name that CVE.org is using. If we could, but then you got a problem of the third parties when there's loads and loads of them that never entered as CVE, right? So for that, we ought to have, where I work, where I live, you can get a driver's license to drive a car, but you can also get something that looks almost the same, but it's just an identity. So if we could get some kind of thing for, CNAs, where we have a CNA that can drive cars and a CNA that's just an identity. And that would be something, but I'm not trying to push it onto CVE.org. I'm saying something like that.
It's interesting because that extra session, I'll call it the intercession session. We actually talked about, are there tiers of CNAs? In other words, if you met the minimal essential elements, like in the MVVE that Art and Jay spoke to, and you ascribed a certain other characteristic, you would have that identity card. And there's a lot that would probably use it. But to get to like the driver's license, you'd have to enrich your record to be there. And that would be a different tier. And then maybe there's something more where you have to do blah, 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 extra. Okay, notice I didn't name blah, blah, because I don't know what it is. That we could say, okay, that's the Cadillac of, if you will, the BMW, pick your car brand, of driving, and or you're a chauffeur, maybe we call that. And then we've had a conversation, Madison and I did, about what does a CNA LR then do? Because in many respects, it's not the secretariat that should be doing it, because that's operations, but it is a CNA LR duty to help direct it and order that. And I think that's probably where we need to think differently in the CVE program to allow for that to work. Okay, notice these are all possibility thoughts that we've probably talked about in the last month, 2 weeks, week. Madison and I were just talking last week on this, so it's pretty fresh in my mind. So when people at the intercession said, hey, I like that idea about tiering, I didn't think it would sell very well. But the concept that you just spoke to, I think actually does sell. Because now you give people the ability of, I can perform that much, I can at least be an entry bar, and I have a way to get my record there, and I have a federated way to approach to get other things. What we didn't do is make it, in my opinion, easy to adopt.
And it's not clear.
And it's extremely so. It's
We-
something on the board we talked real bad about.
We had the MongoDB, was it Carmen?
Yeah.
That said she wants to do the right thing, but she just doesn't have enough guidance about what the right thing is.
And Alec will tell you, I saw he snuck in here, is that, the secretariat just has a lot of CNAs to work with, and it's got secretariat duties, and it's got developmental duties, and it's got all this meeting stuff, and, they're heavy into the admin, and, you only spread so far. So that's one of the reasons we went for federation.
So there's a problem of vendors that most people don't understand, especially those that say, we can use the vendor from their, their DNS entry, right? About half of our third parties have names of 1 or 2 people or 3. Or some of them even say, and friends. You know, because
Oh, you mean for the upstream?
for the name of the vendor,
Oh, for the name of the vendor, okay.
Dieter Schmidt and Joe Blow and their friends. I'm not making this up. In fact, you know, if it was useful, I could give you, a list of vendors in quote that we get from, if that would be helpful for, some of the activities.
Probably useful just to make sure we don't discount something.
Yeah, because the solutions need to work for
Also,
half of our vendors. I'll just say it's half.
Christina, I asked you to hold a thought. I hope you didn't forget it.
Oh, no. I've been waiting to change the subject because I think naming is incredibly important, but I have another blow to you that is even bigger than the naming problem and way harder to solve. I hope you're ready for it. We call it internally the parent-child problem. So components are not just singular packages always. And you as a distro provider know that better than anyone because you guys tend to take components and break them up into teeny tiny packages that get installed separately on your system as dependencies. How do you handle that hierarchical view of CVEs and names, both internally, and how would you handle it for, the global product space?
This problem I've been chasing ever since I got the red hat 6 years ago. And if I told you how we did 6 years ago, I'd be embarrassed.
I'm embarrassed about how we handle it internally now, so don't feel bad.
We had deep knowledge on our products by flat file.
By what? By file?
Flat file.
Like individual .sos, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, like the product, it was a flat file list of what we had, and the guy who was responsible, that's why I had almost 80-person PSER.
Wow.
Didn't scale because at a certain point you'd get to be very expensive. So now, last year, I wrote and got a PSER policy for manifesting.
For what?
Manifesting.
Okay.
So I mandated everyone had to do it. Now, there was a big change for me because instead of me translating what they all did, I made them put it in a language that was easy for me to accept. And then I wrote the standard that supported the policy that said, and it will be in this format. Then I realized I don't go and talk to product teams, I go to pipelines. I had to reduce the scale of my problem, which is kind of what we're talking here. Okay, how do you reduce scale? Make it so, or how do you upscale it, whichever way you want to look at it. But I had to find a way that I could eat not the elephant leg, not the elephant, but the herd of elephants. So in that, I got to describe whether it was, I think we went component package application. I had to go check with Martin on that one. He may say it differently, but you got the idea. To know what was there, and then where do I see it repetitively? So now I know everywhere it is, and I can at least spot it. What I'm working through is what I call my layer problem, which from an application is a dependency problem. Because now you're looking at how you deliver and who has to go first, because you have a base that has to be fixed before you can move up, your layers. Some you can do in parallel, you can't. And so we had to go and rethink our entire process. And what we've done for the last almost 3 years is redesign everything we were doing and not miss anything while we're doing it, which I'll be honest with you, sometimes we were better at than others. Because there's a certain point when you make a switch, you're going to hit that drop. And you got to find a way to catch up. So it's something that we worked real hard on. Our question, and maybe this is the right way to bring it up, is instead of this, and we talked about this in a piece of SIG 10 years ago. We had a session where we had an opening and we just went down the rows and asked everyone how they were doing their incident response. And we had a lot of ServiceNow, which we didn't like, Jira's, which we didn't like a lot, but I think we're using more. But do we actually design more open source wise collectively, some of this to support what we're doing, instead of doing it one-off to meet the same thing. Maybe we should just collectively look at how do we bring it together to do that, so we don't keep fighting each other about what it's called. Revolutionize, please go with it.
Oh, yeah. I think in the open source, OpenSSF, we've started to explore the idea of namespacing for a lot of this. I think you still run into an issue where it's the alias issue as well, which is in the context of this, I'm going to call it system. You might have 12 layers of components, and then down here is a thing, but in a different context, that's a top level component. And then how do you sort of satisfy both of those use cases where you kind of want to say, you know, you have something called Z down here and you have A/B/C/whatever. And in the context of that system, whether it's an application or maybe even a running system or whatever, but then in a separate context when you're just like, hey, I'm distributing that component Z, it's just known as, like, this is what it's known as. And I think would love to yes, definitely work on that in the open. I think it needs to be flexible because different companies are going to want to still be able to say, hey, this is what we kind of call it. There should be some sort of unique identifier, whether it's a GUID or omniboard identifier or something. There needs to be some way to uniquely identify it. But then it's going to be called different things in different contexts, and having that namespacing where, you know, Alice owns A and everything underneath it, Bob owns B and everything underneath it, and so on, is also going to be super important because we're running into a lot of that right now. And then internally, a lot of our customers are saying the same thing. They want to say, hey, Alice owns the department and all the sort of components and CVEs that belong, not the department, but owns this SaaS and all the things underneath it, right? And then Bob owns the, you know, API service subcomponent and owns everything underneath it. And then at some point you have, you know, Charles or whomever who owns like this one piece of software and then is responsible for fixing the CVEs in that. And how do you kind of get it to that point where you get that hierarchy and you get that ability to see into all of that without it being just a nightmare. I don't know. Because it's already a rat's nest as it is.
Yeah, you described Nirvana. I would love to get to that. I don't know how I break that historical precedent of we've always done it this way and we like having it here.
Well, tracking the hierarchy is one thing because the hierarchy is going to look different in different namespaces, like you mentioned. And SPDX sort of has approached trying to track the hierarchy, but I don't think it went far enough. So they added the ability, even though it's kind of like a flat SBOM, but they added the ability to track relationships between components. But it's still really like just an add-on rather than seeing it from a hierarchical view, right, from the top down. And to give an example, like, you know, if I'm tracking NVD's OpenSSL, or, you know, you have OpenSSL-libs and you might have other packages that it depends on. How are you tracking the CVE at the top level, for example, in Red Hat, all the way down through those libraries and which it applies to?
So we tried simplifying by putting OpenSSL through RHEL. So if you
Say
need
that again?
through RHEL.
Okay.
So you have to have RHEL in your container or image wherever you're going. So we focus there. Now the problem with OpenSSL is FIPS, which is a different problem.
That's a problem.
Okay. But because you have to look at that, and then you got PQC, which is a different problem, but similar, is how do you manage your crypto? And so that becomes a whole different problem. And that's why we directed it through RHEL, because now we went down to that one name department. I'll use your example, is that department is the only ones who will fix that. And now we know everyone has to pull it from there. So now I just track it where they pull it from there, and that becomes a dependency. So that was my way of, luckily engineering, I didn't have to fight them. I actually just followed along with them.
But that's just one example. There's just
I know.
tons of libraries that have a libs appended to them, right?
And that's,
Red Hat just separates out everything into little tiny components.
so the problem for us is, and I can only describe it this way, is we try to register everything and then reposit everything. If I can register it, then I know in the manifest where it should be. And then what I'm checking in our SDL is that actually pull it from there. And then, you know, final check as we do the build, is that where it came from? Because we had the licensing path we have to go check, which Bruce talked about a little bit. And those have to be able to support each other. That was the only way I know to get there with any degree of comprehension and speed.
And your answer to that tracking of CVEs is VEX documents.
That's my external. Yeah.
Okay, but how do we translate that sort of namespace tracking to something like MITRE or CVE?
So in this case, if I said, what do I pick? I'll just call it glibc.
Okay, good. That's a great one.
I can't believe I picked that one. Because now we got a CVE and everyone will talk about it's a problem, right? And let's say it's in the API, but it's not in some of the other functions. Then when a customer gets it, their scanner triggers. And I go back and say, wait a minute, read the description, read the VEX file. It actually says, you know, we're calling a function and the API is not exposed to, you know, the internet. It doesn't have a daemon in there to run it, etc. Now, that's not vulnerable.
But a mature scanner will already know that is running in Red Hat, and Red Hat security advisories would say not applicable, right?
It should, and they should, but you're assuming the level of maturity is higher.
Oh, okay.
My experience has not for that. I'm not saying it's not there. I just haven't seen it. Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wanted to make a statement before our time is up here that after listening to this conversation, I sort of have imposter syndrome because I worked with Chris Turner quite a bit, but I just started assigning CPEs based on what NVD was doing, and I did it for every single product that we have. Now, am I doing it wrong? I don't know, but nobody's yelling at me. So, but give me feedback if we are doing it wrong. I just started doing it.
I think you're doing it different, but you had a slightly different construct than I have. Okay. I'm not going to speak for everyone else because of where I'm pulling my packages and that it's basically 90% external and probably a little higher than that. And I modify things and I package things. And, you know, when I start doing things internally, I either write code or I am now taking no longer maintained upstream and I now fork the code. And it's a totally different ball of wax than what you're doing because you already own that code from before. You don't have the problem of following upstream that I do and the naming convention I do. So it's easier for you to extend what NVD already had. So I don't think you're wrong.
I'm not
I
sure
just
it's
think
useful.
I think you have, I'll say it, unfair advantage, dang it. And good for you, you know, if that works and it works for the system, why change? Now, the question is, for the rest of us, if we can't follow that, what can we do so we can be representative of software like you are? I'm going to assume it works and it's correct and no one's hollering, don't break it.
Okay. I won't feel like an imposter then.
I'm an imposter, don't.
But I'm open to suggestions if anybody thinks I'm doing it wrong.
So I don't know if I really answered your question. It's kind of like, oh, we'd have to sit down and like have a
I'm
whiteboard.
just bringing it up to put it on the scratch pad, like, you know.
I think Chris and I have that one because the beauty is my Martin is the co-chair on the AWG. So sometimes I don't worry about it because he's got it figured out for me. Later on, he's got to educate me so I say it correctly.
But one more quick thing while I have the mic. I brought this up in the previous session, not this one, but one earlier, I had a controversial idea, especially back related to, CNAs. I don't think CNA should be the only one who should be able to assign CPEs or Purls to CVE records. I know that might be controversial to some, but
Oh,
Just
so
put it
you're
at that.
saying that other entities should be able to assign or add CPEs
if
and
you-
Purls to a record?
if you meet a bare minimum of having an ID, right, and you know that a CVE affects your product, you should be able to add it.
So we do that with the container model within the CVE record today. So I don't know if you've noticed, like CISA adds enriched data to a lot of records. That includes CPE. Go ahead, Alec. Oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah, I was thinking it was my software identity thing you brought this up. Yeah. So I think the issue at hand actually is the suggestion that when Megazone was in the room and answered was this idea that the concept, for example, that using the container method that you mentioned, CNAs may be able to provide their own data for relevance of that record to their own, their own advisory related to this vulnerability, right? And so the idea, like we have this vehicle now in the ecosystem called an ADP, right? And you mentioned the one that's used, right? Which is to add data to another CNA's record. And this is one element of that data that's been discussed at length, but that's not been resolved. And that's one of those solutions is like, well, if everybody was able to use this ADP technology to provide relevance for their own shop regarding that vulnerability. Yeah.
I would take it further and say that even the distros and other package managers should be able to provide relevant information.
So we're talking on like it's for kernel to the Linux packages, and that's a conversation between kernel and Linux packages. I think for what Alec just spoke to, I'd rather we get the definition of what it is for our go forward, and then look about, do we need to be an ADP for our old records? I think that's really, instead of going back and recreating every record, I think we go back and you can ADP your records either in a sequential backwards or as you get engaged about that problem set. Question is, do you do all of it? And I don't think we should do all of it. That's just work for nothing.
So late to the party and maybe just halfway connected to your previous discussions, but kind of a comment to what you're saying is that we as a vendor would really like to be an ADP. I think I brought that up last year. I'm really happy that this is now gonna be a thing. Please tell me on how we can do that. But so then the question, the second question would be that we would want to basically connect the question of naming and basically routing in the vulnerability realm with that feature, because what we have is basically a set of SBOMs for each product where we say like this thingy, whatever we name it, contains these components. But what we didn't think about from my perspective is like the root of the SBOM also has a name because it's obviously a node that is affected. And I think those concepts somehow should be able to be brought together in a way that for kind of the CVE assessment and all the information that we publish, it's not that we only want to say like, okay, we have also something to that CVE to say. So we are an ADP and say like, okay, we are also affected by this. But we would want to say like, even we are affected by this because of that upstream component in our SBOM, because there might be, and I think some of you might know due to the release processes in different products, it might be that in one solution or in one product that we sell, we have like 12 different versions of OpenSSL, like 2 versions of Debian, 1 version of Red Hat, and kind of 1 upstream vanilla version for whatever reasons. And then basically we might be affected of the same vulnerability 4 times based on different upstream dependencies. So basically that complicates the problems on so many multiple layers. But I thought maybe I bring this idea into the discussion and kind of in one sentence, what do I want? If I can add the information for downstream components in the CVE program, can I please also add which upstream component made me affected?
Yep. Yep, there have been some discussions on that internally. But yeah, I think we're getting cut off, so we can talk about it afterwards.
It was a good open session. Thanks for everyone.
Yep.
Thank you, Pete and Chris, for leading that great discussion. Really fantastic interaction. So for on-site participants, we don't have anything else in this room yet today. So if you want to stay here and work or whatever, the site's open. For those, well, on-site and virtual, there is one other session happening at 3, CNA Birds of a Feather Open Forum with certified naming authorities. So feel free to slide on over to that one. Again, that's room 7 here. And then at 3:30, all these times are in Eastern time. We do have a networking break with in the exhibitors room in room 2 on site. So then things will be picking back up at 4 Eastern in earnest, and then we'll be going to 4 to 5. So yeah, thanks everybody. And we will check Discord to see if there's any additional questions. So perhaps we can ask Pete and Chris to check the Discord channel for this one. I think there was one question from earlier that didn't get answered. So if you get a chance, take a look at that. Thanks, everybody.